Hello and welcome to another Bobby Fischer game here. In this, I'm going to talk about how even the greatest chess players, they're not perfect. They're so much better because they're at a lot higher level than the average player, of course, but they even overlook things once in a while. Maybe that'll inspire you to work at your own chess and try and improve. And just remember that nobody's perfect. So let's take a look at this game with Bobby Fischer here. He has the black pieces. He's playing against Robert Byrne, another strong chess master from back in 1971 when this game was played in New York. The game begins with e4, which Bobby Fischer was known for playing probably more than anything else with white. So maybe Robert Byrne wanted to play a little psychological warfare against Bobby Fischer by pushing the e4 pawn. And now we have Fischer playing his favorite Sicilian defense here against e4. After knight to f3, this move covers the d4 square, allowing you to push this pawn up here to d4 in the future if you choose to do that. And now we have d6. That guards the e5 square. That way, if Bobby Fischer wants to bring this knight out, the pawn will be less likely to try and harass that knight because it could be captured. So the game continues with d4. Now, this will become the open Sicilian because after capture and recapture, the position is a little more open. Fischer attacks this unprotected pawn, and so his opponent defends that. And now, Fischer's favorite variation in the Sicilian defense is played, the Najdorf variation. And Fischer won many games with this Najdorf variation, but it's very complicated. For beginners, maybe you don't want to start out with this opening. Sure, you can try and play it for fun and see how it goes, but be warned that it is a little more complicated. So now we have bishop to e3 being played, the English attack in the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian defense. Now, this move, of course, it develops a bishop, centralizes it, helps back up this knight, and now Fischer pushes this pawn in the center. So what does this do? Well, it immediately attacks the knight, of course, and Fischer's opponent will have to figure out what to do with that knight. But it does leave this backwards d-pawn. So that could be a weakness in the endgame if pieces are traded off and there's no way to push that d-pawn to d5, which is a big strategy in the Sicilian. Often if you can get your d-pawn with the black pieces here pushed to d5, it kind of frees up black's position a little bit more and it's not so cramped. Especially right now, this bishop is just blocked in by its own pawn. So the knight retreats back, and now we have Fischer developing the bishop. He's ready to castle kingside if he wants to. And f3 is played, fortifying this pawn, relieving the knight of guard duty on that pawn. So in the future, the knight may try and jump up here to this outpost, where it's backed up by the e4 pawn. So now Fischer immediately castles here, and his opponent pushes the queen up, perhaps with the idea of queenside castling, and then the game could become more exciting if we have kings castled on opposite sides, because generally when that happens, you want to push your pawns forward. Now, if both sides, castled on the same side, generally you would be less likely to push those pawns in front of your king because it would create weaknesses. So Fischer, he develops here, helping guard this d5 square. As I mentioned, the d5 square is very important in a lot of variations in the Sicilian defense. And if he wants to push that pawn in the future, he needs to gain control of that d5 square. So the knight, the bishop, and the queen are all backing that up. And at the moment, we have pawn, knight, and queen. And if he castles queenside, we'll have a rook guarding that as well. So Robert E. Byrne does, in fact, castle queenside. So we have opposite side castling, which will lead to a more exciting game, as now these pawns can start storming up the board, trying to attack, whereas Bobby Fischer can push his pawn forward and try and get his pawns moving over here on the queen side. So the game continues with knight developing, and now we have the pawn storm. So this pawn is pushing forward, threatening to chase the knight, and the game continues with Bobby Fischer countering with his own pawn storm over here on the queen side. And in these opposite side castling games, it's almost like a race where both sides start throwing their pawns forward in these pawn storms, and a lot of times whoever will get their attack in first will have an advantage, maybe even a winning advantage. So Fischer's opponent continues forward, attacking the knight. We have the knight jumping forward here to the edge of the board, and generally you don't want a knight on the rim, or the saying, the knight on the rim is dim. And that's because the knight doesn't really control as many squares over here. It can go here, but it would be captured at the moment. It could go here, but then the bishop would capture, pawn recaptures, and then the queen grabs an extra pawn. So that knight is kind of playing a defensive role here. The game continues with Byrne jumping his knight onto that outpost. And so after capture, we have the pawn capturing. Otherwise, if the queen would have captured, well then we could have a recapture of this pawn over here with the queen and bishop battery. So this kind of helps Fischer. It plugs that hole that would have been a good outpost for, especially if this knight could somehow reposition up to here, which, is not possible at the moment. That would be a great spot for that knight. But now that the hole is plugged, let's see how things continue. Fischer grabs the half-open file and lines up on his opponent's king. And the computer says that's a mistake, that it would have been better to play f6 here. But maybe that would weaken up the king side a little bit, but that would be a threat. If the pawn captures, the knight could recapture, moving back towards the center. So let's see how things go. Bishop is developed here, lining up on the knight. And now we have the rook stepping forward. And once again, the computer says this is a mistake. Preparing perhaps to double up rooks at some point. If this rook can get over here, the queen would have to move out of the way, and that would take some time. So, knight to a5. Now, why does the computer say this is the best move? Well, it kind of blocks the pawn storm, blocks this a pawn, especially if a pawn could push here, and then, I don't know, maybe the other one could back it up, this one or this one. But, Fischer does have a rook lined up on his opponent's king here. So the knight drops back, and now we have bishop attacking this unprotected knight on the edge of the board. So the knight jumps forward. Instead of just playing defensively and opening up some holes around the king side, Fischer jumps forward, and after Now here, this is interesting. The bishop pair could be given up with capture, pawn captures, queen recaptures. But, then this knight would not be protected over here on a5, and there could be a future discovered attack on that. So let's see what happens. Fischer's opponent decides to push that h-pawn, maybe to continue his pawn storm up here. And now we have a counter thrust by Fischer. He pushes forward, attacking the bishop. Now, there is the possibility of capturing en passant. Let's see if his opponent does that. Yes, he captures en passant. And then we have the recapture. And now, a pin. This looks like a good move. Pinning the rook to the queen here. But the computer doesn't like it, saying that's a mistake. White would still be ahead after this move. But apparently, knight to c6 would have been better. So, looks like it would be better to go here. Then after capture, we'd have recapture. And instead of going after this pawn, apparently bishop to e7, protecting this first, as the battery is attacking and the queen was the only thing defending. And now they would recommend h5. And at this point, white would have been ahead. h6 to slow things down over here. And now what? Either the king moves over, or once again, that pin is still available here. So before I get into too much, let's just go back and see what happened in the game. All right, the pin is in play, but it does allow this capture. Queen captures, and apparently king capturing would have been a little bit better. So now queen recaptures, and the knight is under attack. So that is probably why king capture was preferred, because then the queen would still be over here guarding that knight. Now something has to be done about the knight that's under attack. So the knight jumps onto the outpost. We have this rook move by Bobby Fischer. So, according to the computer, this is a mistake. h5. Well, that's interesting. Yeah, h5, I guess, would attack the bishop, and it would be protected by that knight. So let's see what Bobby Fischer has in mind. We have capture, recapture, king to b1, and it's worth mentioning that usually chess masters, when they castle queenside, with black or white, often you'll see this king to b1 move. I guess it protects this pawn. It kind of gets the king out of the line of fire on this open c file. And of course, there's this threat, moving the rook here and pinning the queen to the king. So king to b1 was kind of forced here. So Fischer follows through with his plan, rook to c1, attacking the queen, and the queen moves up to b3, and apparently that is a mistake. Queen up to f5. The computer definitely likes that better. So let's see. If queen went up to f5, they recommend what? Queen over to f8. I mean, I guess I could play this move for you. So queen to f5. Actually, they're recommending bishop to e7 now. All right, before I get sidetracked, let's get back to the action here and see what happened. How did this game progress? The knight jumps forward, a missed opportunity. Apparently, h5 would have been better. Now the queen attacks that knight, and it's forced to just jump back to where it was. So we have rooks confronting one another, and Bobby Fischer is behind in material. So when you're behind in material, you generally do not want to trade more pieces. You probably want to trade off pawns instead. But Fischer attacks this bishop first. We have the retreat here, or excuse me, not a retreat, an attack with check. So now we have a nice outpost, but the knight can capture. So it looks like Fischer, who does not want to trade off material, like I said, because he's behind, he leaves that bishop on the outpost there, and he has his knight on this good outpost here. So queen checks. That is blocked by the pawn push. And now the rook adds pressure. Computer doesn't like that, saying that's a mistake, and now Bobby Fischer is ahead here. Even though he is down in material, the knight is doing a good job of covering that pawn. What would have been better? Apparently a3, giving that king maybe a little escape hatch, and also covering this square in case the pawn starts pushing forward. Okay, Fischer moves his king up, an inaccuracy. It looks like it would have been better to just go ahead and trade off rooks. But, like I said, generally you want to keep material on the board if you're behind in material. So, rook up to the outpost. We have an exchange. Now there's a passed pawn here, but will it be strong enough to do anything? Queen attacks that pawn, which is protected by the queen at the moment. And now the rook gets behind the passed pawn. That's usually a good idea because now that pawn is threatening to start pushing up the board. Knight captures here. So Fischer grabs the bishop. Queen attacks. Now a pawn is exchanged. So it is Fischer who is ahead by +1 at the moment. The bishop drops back here. And now Fischer has a great blockader. A knight is usually a good blockader of pawns, preventing this passed pawn from making any forward progress. Fischer kind of plays an inaccuracy here. Probably a waiting move just to see what his opponent is trying to do. Here, this a3 move is played now, and the computer does like it. We have a5, and the rook grabs the open file with a possible threat of moving that rook up here and threatening mate in 1. Now, I guess Fischer could capture here, capture the pawn with the queen. And maybe if the rook does come up here to d7, the knight could move over and protect that bishop. So in the game, we have queen capturing. The rook does indeed move up here, threatening a mate in 1 against Fischer. The knight protects the bishop, preventing that, and also blocking maybe an attack on this pawn as well. So now there's a fork of queen and knight here. So what can Fischer do about this? Well, he drops back. Now Fischer, if we look at this, material is even, but it's unbalanced. Queen moves up, protecting the pawn. King steps up here to a2, and this is a missed opportunity. Apparently, it would have been better to go ahead and capture. Then after recapture, what next? The rook could move here to d6 and maybe go after these pawns. That's one possibility. The computer recommends king up to c2 at the moment, but Fischer would have a pair of passed pawns here. So in the game, we had this, king to a2, The passed pawn is running here. And a blunder. So, very interesting here. We have a blunder. And this is where I was saying that Fischer's not perfect. And we've seen in this game, both sides have made mistakes and inaccuracies. But also, as I mentioned earlier, the Najdorf Sicilian can lead to some wild, crazy games that are complicated. And even complicated for the best players in the world. So, that's probably why Fischer picked the Najdorf Sicilian, to confuse his opponents. And that would work, unless he's playing against the best players in the world. Robert Byrne, he was a pretty strong chess master, but he never made it to the very top level of players in the world. You had the other great players like Spassky and Petrosian, all the other world champions who could handle these complicated lines better than Robert Byrne. So here, this move is played, and we see the advantage that Fischer had just disappeared there. So what should have been played? It looks like Queen to F2. Fischer should have played this move, threatening a mate in 1 here. So even Fischer overlooks things sometimes. How can you stop this? The bishop and queen are lined up here, and there's a threat of mate in 1. And it looks like the best way to stop it is either give up your queen by capturing, or maybe a little bit better would be to give up your rook. But either way, you're going to be down in material and losing. So, interesting little sideline there. I mean, Fischer just missed that. I don't know what was going on back in 1971 in this game. Let's see. I guess Fischer just overlooked it. So in the game, instead of moving the queen here and threatening a mate in 1, Fischer just pushes his king up. So now we have Fischer's opponent threatening a mate in 1. So after that is avoided, protecting the bishop, we have queen trade, and material is still even here. 2 pawns, and then a bishop and 2 pawns versus a rook. But Fischer has this passed pawn here. The game continues with an attack on the pawns here, an inaccuracy. King up to b3 would have been better. And that passed pawn is running. So an attack on the pawn. It just keeps moving. Now it gets behind the passed pawn, usually a good idea. And pawns are traded. So Fischer captures the H pawn. His opponent captures the E pawn. But now Fischer has this dangerous pair of passed pawns over here on the king side, where his king can help these pawns, but his opponent's king is kind of out of play over here. So the game continues with the bishop getting out of the way of this H pawn, and Fischer's opponent trying to get his king into the action. And remember, you have to do that in an end game when there are hardly any pieces on the board. The kings must be activated to help, unless there's a mate threat. So we push forward. His opponent trying to get rid of the pawns over here. After capture, the passed pawn is running. And this is where Robert Byrne resigned. So the game ends here because there's no way to stop this h-pawn without giving up the rook here. Of course, the rook can't go here. I mean, give me a minute. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the game review, and then we'll come back to this and see what Fischer could have actually done here. So it looks like, oh, hold on. I wanted to do the review. Why is this thing in the way here? There we go. All right. So Fischer played at a 2600 level versus 2250 by his opponent. Fischer played at 87.1% accuracy rating versus 83.2. And you see this big dip here. That's the missed opportunity where Fischer overlooked that attack. Although I guess it doesn't matter as much since he won in the end. But 5 great moves by his opponent, 3 by Fischer. Inaccuracies, 4 by Robert Byrne, 3 by Fischer. 5 mistakes by Fischer's opponent, and even Fischer had 4 mistakes. They both had 2 misses, but 1 blunder by his opponent. So now, if we go back here and we see what could have happened, it looks like the move recommended is this, rook to d2. And then you just start marching that pawn up. Or g5 could be played. You could move the other pawn. So the rook has to go here. It doesn't have to. That's one way to stop it. Or it could go up here and threaten to check. The king would move, and then it could come down here after this pawn. But if the rook just plays here to stop the pawn, then the other pawn starts moving. And then what? We have rook to f1, g4. King might as well capture this pawn. But now the rook can get out, or excuse me, the bishop can get out of the way. Then what? You don't want to, we'll just play what the computer recommends the most here. Rook to f8. Oh, I don't know. That doesn't look so good. Because then that pawn can promote. So, and we don't really want to move that because you could go here. Yeah, it's just looking bad. You could go here and threaten to block, and then of course if the rook comes up, then the pawn just promotes. So, I guess we might as well go with the best move. Now they recommend g3. You could even play promote. But then Fischer would just be winning here. So this is just one example of how the game could go. I don't know. That just looks terrible. So I guess the computer is just recommending garbage because there's only garbage moves left when you're so far in trouble here. So if we go back, after this move, what happens if you push that? Well, then this just starts moving, and these pawns are pretty much unstoppable here. Okay, feel free to leave comments, like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. And stay tuned for future Bobby Fischer videos. I hope these are instructional for you and help you improve your own chess. Thank you for watching, and have a super chess day.